Thank you. Good morning. Oh, I have this. Okay. Good morning. I'm all in favor of just letting Charles sing for an hour. How about you? That was spectacular. Every time I hear you, it just gets better and better. How is that even possible? So thank you so much. Good morning. My beard is very bushy. Yes, I've been in Cambodia for most of January, and I've discovered a new trick that my children in my schools there love. I can hide pencils in my beard, and then they start to giggle, and then they want to pull the pencil out. So you know how peekaboo becomes this never-ending thing? Don't ever put a pencil in your beard in a school in Cambodia, because then that's all that they'll want to do. So I fooled them one day, and I put a Twizzler in there, and then I chewed it. So my goal is to have it out to here so that I can feed all of the children Twizzlers. Yeah. Oh, what a journey we are on. We are spiritual beings, and I like to say that we are spiritual beings having a spiritual experience. I love some Pierre de Teilhard-Chardin, and I also like to expound upon things and understand that nothing really is away from the spiritual experience. It's just that our spiritual experience is happening in degrees. So for some of us, at some times, that degree is very heightened, and we are very much aware of the spiritual experience that's taking place around us. And at other times, that degree diminishes so much, and our humanness seems to be the thing that overrides and becomes full frontal, and we are at the mercy of effect. But when we start to really practice and understand the principles that we subscribe to as metaphysicians, we begin to understand that we cannot escape, nor will we ever want to, the idea of a spiritual experience. And what I love about that is that it reminds us, it gets us still long enough to say that there's one activity going on, and that's a divine encoding. A divine encoding. It's the same thing that exists within the caterpillar, that instructs the caterpillar to morph into its transitional phase into being a butterfly. It's the same thing that is inside of an acorn that knows exactly what to do in order to grow into a majestic oak. It's the same thing that's in a bud. And the bud knows exactly what to do in order to burst forth and become a blossom. And the great thing is that the bud doesn't need a life coach in order to be able to do that, because it has this divine encoding, right? It's the same thing that's in an embryo that knows exactly how to grow into infancy. And the beautiful thing is that that divine encoding is a mainstay. It is something that will constantly be there. And what's interesting about that is all the examples that I gave you are pretty much centered around natural law. But when we think about ourselves as a spiritual being and our relationship to that divine encoding, what starts to happen is the responsibility now becomes one where it's more in the mental phase, the consciousness phase, rather than in the natural state. So how do you and I become congruent so that that divine encoding can lead us and do with us what it wants to? And what makes it halt? What makes it veiled? What makes it repressed? And really the only thing that does that is our belief system. I love the author Carolyn Mace, and she wrote once about something called the 6-second theory. And she said something that literally takes 6 seconds still governs what we think about ourselves to this very day. 6 seconds. Can you imagine? That's a second grade teacher that just looked at you and said, "Why don't you mouth the words, okay?" And you may have loved to sing, but what happened in that 6 seconds? You pushed that free-spirited nature down. It's an overheard comment from a parent that says that you're not good at math, or that you're never going to succeed, or you're going to waste your life. It's all these kind of little sound bites that lock themselves into our subjectivity that begin to influence and veil that divine encoding. When I was 7, my father passed away, and I was the last of a tribe of children. And I grew up in Beaumont, Texas, very, very poor, and remember the days of the rotary phone. Well, the rotary phone was right in my mother's entryway into the bedroom, and I actually slept in that room in a corner on a cot because there wasn't enough bedrooms to go around for all of us children. And so when the VA hospital called in the middle of the night to alert her that my father had passed away, I was right there. Phone rings, 3 a.m. I can even hear the attending nurse telling her all of the information. And when she took it all and she hung up the phone, she then picked the phone back up and she rotary dialed my aunt, told her what happened, and then she said this: "What am I supposed to do with a 7-year-old boy?" I heard that. And in that 6-second moment in my 7-year-old consciousness, in that framework, I determined that somehow I must be a burden, that somehow I was not welcomed. And I didn't sit up on my cot and say, this is my new normal, this is my new belief. But something subconsciously worked itself in that, so much so that when I became aware of that memory in my adulthood, I could look back and I could see how that one little soundbite formulated almost all of the decisions that I made growing up as a young adult, trying to be in show business, living in New York City, then Los Angeles, realizing that everywhere that I showed up, there was this belief that I didn't deserve to be in the room, and that I was going to have to work extra hard. I was going to go 1,000% compared to everybody else's 100%. And when I reflected back and that memory was there, I was astonished at how powerful that one little soundbite was. And I'm here this morning to tell you that we all have those. We have a collection of 6-second moments. And it is those things that are the oppressor or the veils. In the Hindu tradition, they call it Maya. It's the Maya that veils the divine encoding, that diminishes the degree by which that genius and intelligence can collaborate with us. And so what do we do about that? I feel that the most successful way is to become curious. Because when we become curious about why we do the things that we do, when we become curious about reflecting back and looking, why is it that every time I try this, this happens? Why is this my trigger point? Why is this my injustice button? Why does this continue to show up? Why do I keep marrying the same person? Why whenever I travel somewhere, I bring to me, I magnetize the same personalities? When we can become curious about that, rather than self-punishing or condemning, then we set ourselves up to be able to remove a lot of those barriers and a lot of those veils. When we become curious, we can then begin to look at our behaviors and strengthen what I call our response abilities. So if you're listening to this talk on audio, I'm not saying one word, responsibility. I'm saying 2 words, response abilities. And I believe that the encoded genius within us sits in wait for the strengthening of our response abilities. And so what I've noticed is that oftentimes when we create an intention and we say, okay, my aim is to advance my awareness, it reminds me of my favorite quote, which is actually in the Course in Miracles, and it says, "Love brings up everything unlike itself." Oh, goody. And I used to go, what does that even mean? And I would sit there and I'd contemplate that. Love brings up everything unlike itself. And then I tapped into the idea that what that was saying for me was that if I advocate for love, if I stand up before you and I say, I am an advocate for love, then everything unlike love does what? Comes up. Not to test us, not to beat us down, but to help us make good on our advocacy. Other words, it's just lip service. And too much of our lives, I think, sometimes is centered around lip service and not enough in-depth embodiment. And so if I'm going to say that I am a student of these spiritual principles, then everything that is counterintuitive to those spiritual principles shows up. Not to test us, but to give us the opportunity to strengthen what it is that we're saying that we're wanting. If you say that I'm an advocate for peace, then everything unlike peace does what? I know you're all sitting there going, why did I come this morning? I really didn't need to hear that. And all of my students go, well, I'm not going to advocate for anything. I'm just going to come over here and I'm just going to sit down. I'm going to be really quiet. But no, it isn't punitive. It's actually very intelligent when you think about it. Think about the divine design. Think about why it is that you and I are as souls are here. We're not here to plateau. We're not here to stagnate. We are here to spiral up. And in our spiraling up, then everything that seems out of balance with that just simply arises in order for us to give the opportunity to say yes and to dive deeper into that. And so we strengthen our response abilities rather than being reactive. The distinction to me between reaction and response is that reaction is unconscious. We become very unconscious and we react. We deflect when those things hit us. When we read something or somebody says something, it's like it triggers that 6-second moment or those collection of 6-second moments within us. But as we start to do the work, we pause, we take a breath, and we look at our response to those things, and we begin to strengthen our abilities and go, I see that this is an opportunity. And I know it's easier said than done. But did you know that I'm letting go of the word trigger? When you hear the word trigger, what does that bring up for you? It triggers you when I say the word trigger, right? You know, the trigger is that thing that sets us off, that puts us into reaction mode. But if everything is a part of this divine encoding, then what if it's not a trigger? What if it's a signal? A signal. Think about the difference between a trigger and a signal. If everything is working together for our good, to them that love the law, to them that live according to the law's purpose, when we live by that and adopt that and we make that our advocacy, then what if the things that are showing up for us are not triggers but signals in order to help us make good on our advocacy? So I want to give you some tangibles this morning. And first I want to preface how I didn't do a very good job this past week. So to make you feel better about yourself, you can look at me and go, awful person. My father, who passed away, he gave our family a gift. That gift was a genetic heart dysfunction. And it's called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It's one of the main things that assisted all of my siblings to transition, except for one. He didn't get that particular gene. Nephews and nieces have also transitioned. And accompanied with that, which I inherited, was also a relationship with chronic atrial fib, which I've had for decades. And I've been able to manage my life around that. Sometimes there would be a reprieve, but oftentimes those two collaborative things just made me really have to gear up in order to do life, and to do life at the level that I wanted to do. And of course I prayed and I did affirmative prayer, and I did all of the things that I knew as a metaphysician to do. Louise Hay was my first teacher, and I traveled with Louise for 3 years, so it was always in my face about what was my opportunity as I looked at her. And I remember in my youth, when I was traveling with her, she would say, honor the entirety of your journey, David. Honor the entirety of your journey. And I'd go, but you don't know about my journey. And she'd go, yes, I do. And I'd go, no, you don't. And yes, I do. And I would want to cherry pick things that were the reasons why I couldn't succeed. And she goes, honor the entirety of your journey. That was the legacy that she left me. And so as I honored the entirety of my journey, I began to look at all of these gifts, these things which were a part of the encoding of my human heart. And I knew that when there was the right circumstance and the right people, that the solution would present itself. In fact, I lived my life from a motto of solution already exists. And the solution showed up. Who knew that Kaiser and Emory were going to merge in cardiology? Who knew? Longtime Kaiser person. And so when I found that out, Emory announced this new ablation technique for people like me that had these multiple situations. And it was going to require 2 surgeons, an electrophysiologist and a cardiac surgeon working together in order to produce this new result. It's only been done about 150 times. The challenge with it is scheduling 2 doctors at the same time from 2 different organizations. 6 months. Finally happened. It was February the 15th, a week ago from Friday. And so my one living brother actually came to be with me. I had a fun little entourage at the hospital. We checked in at 5:45 in the morning. I made great friends with the anesthesiology team. We were all laughing and having a good time. And the last thing I knew were celestial bells were ringing as I drifted off. And I don't know, maybe several hours later, I came to, and there was no one from the surgical team in the room, but there was an attendant there. And she goes, it didn't happen. Snapping gum, snapping gum. It didn't happen. And I was like, I don't know what she's saying. She's certainly not talking to me. She goes, it didn't happen. And what she was revealing was that when they put the ventilator down my throat and they began to start the surgery, they discovered a blood clot. And the blood clot had only formed within the 3 days prior to the surgery. It was as if the divine encoding said, not now. Somehow that blood clot was revelatory enough where they immediately ceased the surgery and canceled it. So when I came to and I realized that, there was this profound, I would like to say, response. But no, it was a profound reaction. And I felt so defeated. And I looked at all of the placement of all of the work. How many of you have put long hours and so much of your will and your financial investment into things, and we think that as we're controlling this process, it's got to look a certain way, and then it just doesn't happen. And any of us who grew up in situations where there was a great deal of chaos or uncertainty or abuse, we've grown into majestic control freaks. Or I'd like to say control athletes. And so I could sense that part of me, that control part that was like, I can't believe this happened. And I was embarrassed. I had so many people praying, and I almost felt responsible that they were going to have to pray again. And so I've been home for a little over a week, getting all of the anesthesia out of my system, working at this rescheduling process again, and basically my life is on hold. I was supposed to go to India because we're building a school in a slum there for one of my school projects. And as I look at all of that, and it's just in this big nebulous form, I realize that there's great opportunity to work on my response abilities. So even when we can't see it, even when it looks as though we've dotted every I and crossed every T, there are still these things that come up for us. And just like love brings up everything unlike itself, sometimes our need to control things brings up everything unlike our ability to control. Does that mean that that divine encoding is absent? Absolutely not. Is it a trigger or is it a signal? And I've realized that it is a signal that's saying, calm down. I realized how in-depth my ability to plan my schedule, my travels, my foundation, what needs to happen, the donations, the fundraising, all of the things that need to come. And sometimes those things get disrupted. And they need to be disrupted because at times we get too conformed and too comfortable to a particular regimented thing, and we become unaware of the divine encoding that knows far greater than we do. Have you ever had that happen? Have you ever realized that once we let go, that intelligence, that divine encoding says, how about this? And I've started to notice as I look at a blank schedule over the next 2 months, as I wonder where the income's going to come from, all of a sudden what begins to happen is the phone rings and this conversation, and I have the space now to be able to go and meet and to go over here and to do these things, and I'm just in paying attention mode. And what I appreciate about all of this is the fact that we are always, always operating from beginner's mind. The most dangerous thing that we could ever tell ourselves is that we know this already. And so I stand before you this morning, not as a teacher, but as a fellow student, recognizing and understanding that as we continue to walk this path, as we continue to explore, our one real responsibility is to work on our response abilities and to strengthen those things. And so let me give you one tangible. How many of you worry? Oh, wow, just a few of you. Okay, good. You were too worried to raise your hand. So worry. When we talk about worry, when we study worry, when we become all spiritual in our verbiage about worry, we talk about the fact that it's a wasted use of our imagination, all of those good things. And we a lot of times want to push it away or not admit to it because real spiritual people don't worry. That's why many of you didn't raise your hand. But what if worry is actually a gift? What? What if that divine encoding does not stop in order to do its majestic work through us? What if it doesn't let up? What if it's the incessant whisper in our ear that continues, as the Talmud says, that leans over the blade of grass and whispers, grow, grow, grow? And so what if worry is exactly that? What if it's a signal and not a trigger? And so think of it this way. What if we only worry about things that we've had its opposite? I'll explain. How many of you ever saw the talking head movie, What the Bleep? A long time ago. In that movie, there was a famous allegory that was told. Sometimes people tell it as if it's a true story, but the allegory is there are indigenous people on an island. They're working. Among them is the medicine person, the wise person of the tribe. The wise person looks out over the horizon in the water and sees this figure, this thing that he can't or she can't distinct what it is. Starts to ask all of the tribe's people if they look out, if they can see it, they can't see it. They continue doing their work. The medicine person looks out, that object is getting bigger and bigger. Goes around to everyone and says, do you see that? They go, no, I don't see it. They continue to do their work. Finally, this object is so big, And that all of a sudden, the rest of the tribes people look out and they can see this thing. And the metaphor behind that allegory is that when we don't have a concept of something, we don't see it. When we live our lives in a particular state of myopic nature, we don't necessarily see things. And so those things are not on our radar. And if they're not on our radar, we're not going to worry about them. We worry about things that are on our radar, and we worry about those things because the thing that we are worrying about, we've experienced its opposite. Let me explain. When you worry about money, it's because at some point in your life you had money, or you had sufficiency, or you had enough. Do you follow that? If you worry about unsafety, it's because at some point in your life there were moments of safety. If you worry about not being loved, it's because at some point in your life you did experience some form of love. So we worry about things that we've once had its polar opposite. Did you follow that? Otherwise, we wouldn't be worrying about it. And so if that's true, then what if worry is a gift that's saying, hey, just sending you a signal right here, wanting you to change and shift your focus so that your response abilities strengthen. You don't want to linger too long in the worry. You want to go back to the feeling of what it was like when you had sufficiency. You want to think about what it was like when you had that sense of love. You want to pause for just 2 minutes and think about what it felt like when you were safe. And that's the gift of worry. It's a signal that's saying, redirect your thinking right now. Redirect your thinking right now. These are for chronic worriers. Redirect your thinking right now. Redirect your thinking right now. And if we did that, if that was the ability by which we responded to the awareness of worry, imagine how our lives would change. Because some of us have been worrying about the same thing for decades. And instead of continuing that, what if we stopped and we began to strengthen our ability to respond to the awareness of worry and set up a whole new paradigm of thinking? What then comes with that is all of the veils and all of the oppression of that divine encoding finally has an opportunity to breathe again. It's like coming home. It's the prodigal returning to the arms of the Father saying, I've been here all along. It's the solution that has never left us. It is the opportunity to come and to be in at one-ment with who and what we are. And so I invite you this morning to think about all of the varying ways by which we get to strengthen our response mechanisms. And know that when we do that, we get to taste and we get to savor and we get to remember what it's like to have that encoded genius take us to places that up until this point we've only been able to imagine. And so it is. God bless. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.